In the spring of 1954, in a remote valley of northwestern Vietnam near the Laotian border, a battle unfolded that would echo far beyond the jungle-covered hills. It was called Dien, and it became the moment when a colonial war reached its point of no return. For nearly 8 years, France had fought to restore control over Indochina after World War II. Facing them was the Viet Minh, the nationalist and communist-led force that declared Vietnamese independence in 1945 and refused to accept a return to colonial rule. By late 1953, the conflict had become a grinding war of mobility, ambushes, and shifting fronts. French commanders hoped to force a decisive set-piece battle on terms they believed would favor modern firepower. They chose a valley, long, bowl-shaped, and surrounded by high ground, and decided to turn it into a fortress. If the Viet Minh attacked, French leaders believed they could be broken in open combat. The plan was tied to a larger French strategy associated with General Henri Navarre. The valley's name was Dien Bien Phu. On November 20th, 1953, French paratroopers descended into the valley in Operation Castor, quickly occupying the area and beginning construction of a major base. The position was organized into strongpoints with women's names spread across the valley floor, anchored by a central headquarters under Colonel Christian de Castries. The French relied on an airstrip to bring in troops,
We need to focus our efforts
food,
right here in the
and medical
valley.
supplies. They expected their
Artillery can't be
aircraft to dominate any assault. Yet the geography that seemed to offer control also created a trap. The surrounding hills were not merely scenery, they were commanding heights. The French assumed the Viet Minh could not haul heavy artillery through rugged terrain, could not sustain large forces far from supply lines, and could not encircle a fortified base under constant air attack. But those assumptions underestimated both Vietnamese resolve and Vietnamese logistics. Under General von Nguyen Giap, the Viet Minh moved tens of thousands of soldiers toward the valley, along with artillery pieces that were disassembled, carried, dragged, and pushed into the hills by human effort and improvised engineering. Roads and paths were cut through forests. Supplies flowed by bicycle, pack animal, and on foot. Artillery was dug into mountainsides, camouflaged, and protected. Anti-aircraft guns were positioned to challenge French control of the sky. What was meant to be a fortress began to resemble a bowl with the enemy holding the rim. The battle began on March 13, 1954. Viet Minh artillery opened with a bombardment that shocked French defenders and immediately targeted the airstrip in key positions. That first night, the strongpoint known as Beatrice was assaulted and overrun. The next day, Gabriel fell after fierce fighting. Soon after, Amery collapsed as well. With each loss, the perimeter tightened, and the French reliance on air supply became more desperate. As artillery fire cratered the runway, aircraft could no longer land safely, forcing supplies to be dropped by parachute, often into areas the Viet Minh controlled. Anti-aircraft fire increased the cost of every flight. The wounded accumulated, and the valley's makeshift hospitals filled under constant bombardment. Rain turned trenches into mud. The soundscape became a permanent mixture of shell bursts, digging, and distant shouted orders. General Giap did not rely on one reckless wave. After early attacks, he adjusted tactics, shifting toward methodical siege warfare. Viet Minh forces dug a growing network of trenches and saps, inching closer to the French strongpoints day by day, often at night, under fire. The French tried counterattacks, airstrikes, and artillery barges to break the encirclement, but the Viet Minh positions were well dug in and difficult to destroy. Over weeks, the battlefield compressed into a brutal struggle over a few hundred meters at a time. Names like Dominique and Elaine became synonymous with bitter close combat. Hills were taken, lost, and taken again. Explosions tore open earthworks. Hand-to-hand fighting erupted in trenches, and the line between front and rear disappeared because no place in the valley was safe. Meanwhile, far away, diplomats gathered in Geneva to discuss the future of Indochina. The battle's outcome would shape the negotiating table. By late April, French forces were exhausted, and their position was increasingly fragmented. The isolated southern strongpoint known as Isabelle remained separated from the central complex, while the core defenses around de Castries' headquarters were squeezed by trenches that reached almost to the bunkers. Morale faltered, but many defenders continued fighting with determination. French commanders requested massive external intervention, including proposals for increased American air support. The United States did provide material aid during the war, but direct large-scale intervention at Dien did not occur. In the valley, the siege tightened. Viet Minh artillery continued to pound the base, while anti-aircraft fire choked the skies above it. Supply drops became smaller and riskier. Ammunition and food ran short. The wounded suffered, and each day, the trench lines crept closer. In early May, the final phase began. On May 1st and May 6th, major assaults targeted the remaining key positions, including the heavily contested hills of Elaine. One of the most dramatic moments came when the Viet Minh detonated a tunnel mine under a French position, blasting open the defenses and accelerating the collapse. On May 7, 1954, after nearly 2 months of siege, the central French position was overrun. Colonel de Castries' headquarters fell, and the remaining defenders in the main base ceased organized resistance. Thousands of French and Allied troops became prisoners. The battle did not end the war instantly, but it shattered the illusion that France could win it militarily. Dien Bien Phu became a symbol of a colonized people defeating a modern European army and of an empire reaching its limit. The political consequences arrived quickly. The Geneva Conference, already underway, moved toward an agreement. In July 1954, the Geneva Accords ended the First Indochina War and provided for a temporary division of Vietnam along the 17th parallel, with the expectation of nationwide elections in 1956, elections that ultimately did not take place. France began withdrawing from Indochina, but the end of one war did not bring lasting peace. The division of Vietnam set the stage for a new and far larger conflict that would draw in other powers. Still, to understand that later history, you first have to understand the valley where artillery was hauled up mountains, where trenches slowly strangled a fortress, and where the 20th century's old colonial order met a force it could not contain. At Dien Bien Phu, the battlefield was more than earth and steel. It was a turning point, where the outcome of a siege helped redraw the map of a region, and where the fall of a base signaled the end of an empire's era.